Well, it's very difficult when you're base your life where you sort of identify as something. So I've identified as a very physical person, right? And then along comes something like polycystic kidney disease, which is a genetic condition, and you just watch your physical attributes decline. Like they slowly at first, it's like going broke, slowly at first and then all at once. I was trying to do everything I could to stay in shape for the transplant that I knew was coming. I went under the knife. I didn't know what percentage of ability I would get back. Yeah, maybe I would survive. Odds were pretty good I would survive, but would I be able to thrive and get back to the things that I love doing? When there are so many reasons to not get moving, when literally every muscle in your body is going, I hurt, just let me stay in bed for today. And you're going, no, we got to get up. We got to get moving, regardless of how we feel. There will be days when the wind is so strong or the storms are so bad that we won't be able to travel. And those will be the days that we rest on. Right now, we can make progress.
Stephan, thanks for being a part of our show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Scott. I'm really excited to be here.
The first thing I have to ask you is, you had an experience. I got to take off my reading glasses here for the listeners. You had an experience that was life-changing. Take us back to that moment and what you were thinking. And I know it's really interesting because you had a kidney transplant, but it was your brother that gave you his kidney. So this is the start of you've had this illustrious, successful career, and you're kind of having a feeling maybe that this could all be coming to an end and all the good things are challenging. Paint a picture for our audience and walk us back through that, please.
Well, it's very difficult when you're base your life where you sort of identify as something. So I've identified as a very physical person, right? The two passions of my life outside of my family would be the martial arts, jiu-jitsu. Obviously, that's a very physical thing. You're striving, you're fighting, you're playing with physically your friends and your enemies in competition. And then the outdoors, where you are passing through the outdoors. And I'd always enjoyed doing longer, more difficult adventures, whether those were hikes or long paddles or doing research in the Arctic. So between the martial arts and the outdoors are these two pillars of, I guess, identity. And then along comes something like polycystic kidney disease, which is a genetic condition, and you just watch your physical attributes decline. Like they slowly at first, it's like going broke, slowly at first and then all at once. So, at first you just get a bit more tired every day and it takes a bit longer to recover. And you're like, man, I'm only in my 40s. Why do I absolutely need to go down and have a nap in the middle of the day when I had a good night's sleep? And then you fall off the cliff. Then you fall off the kidney cliff because your system is just soaked with waste products that aren't being removed. And then you start grasping at straws. And it's you see why there is an entire industry, of like cancer hospitals, right? Like, oh, you're dying of cancer. You can come to our super special hospital based in a different country where we will treat you with all these treatments that aren't allowed in regular society. Well, really, it's a way to extract money from desperate people. So you start feeling really desperate, is my point. I avoided dialysis, but I was right there on the cusp. I was stubborn, so I was still working as a firefighter. I shouldn't have been, but I was. I was trying to do everything I could to stay in shape for the transplant that I knew was coming. Then my brother gave me one of his kidneys, and asking for that was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I went under the knife, and you never know. Like, people die in routine surgeries all the time, so you don't know if you're going to wake up. And maybe a little bit more pertinent, at least to how I go through life, I didn't know what percentage of ability I would get back. Yeah, maybe I would survive. Odds were pretty good I would survive, but would I be able to thrive and get back to the things that I love doing, whether that was jiu-jitsu, whether that was firefighting. I didn't want to take a desk job at the fire department and push paper, and whether that was the outdoors. And that was one of the last images before going under the knife, was I wonder if I can get back up north, and I wonder if I can go explore a certain region of northern Canada that I'd been thinking about and reading about and essentially dreaming about for several decades at that point, but had never had the opportunity to go.
Is this Saskatchewan, or like what is the?
Well, when people think Saskatchewan, they think of like a flat prairie, like um, landscape. But in the far north of Saskatchewan, the landscape changes as you start getting closer to the tree line and the Arctic. You start getting a very rocky uh, kind of country. It's Canadian Shield is what it is. Parts of Minnesota are that. But then if you go further than that, you end up on the tundra and you end up in that tree line area. The tree line's not one sharp line, like there are trees here and then there are no trees there. It's this broad, diffuse area where gradually the trees peter out. And it was mucking about in that area and then heading out onto the full tundra that was singing to me as I was essentially going under the knife.
So you're going under the knife. You're thinking about your life just changing. Everything's flashing before you, and you're kind of finding yourself dreaming of being able to get out into nature and be one
Yes.
in a place that you've always wanted to go, but hadn't quite experienced. And it's another adventure. It's another challenge that you're thinking. You're almost challenging yourself at that moment. So you come out and you find yourself recovering. Take us through the next step, the next chapter here.
Yeah. Well, the recovery from something that major is a long process, right? Your body has to undo a tremendous amount of damage that it was doing to itself to try and keep you alive. But in part spurred on by this vision of being able to return to nature or be able to, in the firefighting parlance, get back to the floor and get back onto the truck. Um, Basically, everything I did was to support the recovery physically, and thus, everything. What is the purpose for the day? The purpose is to get better as fast as I can, and that might mean, really paying attention to nutrition. It might mean doing some exercise. It might mean recovering as best as you can. And what do I need to maximize my recovery? And I think this desire to return to nature was pretty primordial. It's always been where I've gone to, recover from, to process trauma, right? I've had a couple of brothers who've died. What have I done? I've retreated to nature to deal with that. I came close to dying. What did I want to do? I wanted to retreat to nature to process that. That's kind of my, I don't know, my therapy, if you
Yeah.
will.
Well, and it works. So you decide that you're going to accomplish this goal once you do get through this recovery. And can you walk us through presenting this to your spouse? So I was really curious as I looked. I saw in the beginning of your book that you thank your wife for allowing you to go on this crazy journey. But walk me through the conversation. Was it something that you guys had been talking about for a long time? Was it something that you had to kind of throw out at her? And how did she respond after almost losing you to something else?
I have a very strange wife, and that is that she understands uh, that people have dreams and urges, and she has her own. So uh, we knew each other, or we were getting to know each other before I was dying. And then I came clean, like, hey, we can continue this relationship, but just know that this is what I'm dealing with. And she said, no problem. And then she was there for me as I went under the knife. And then I'd been talking about this area, and maybe one day I'd like to do this trip. And she was actually pushing me to go. Now, the cynics would say, "How much was your life insurance, Stephan?"
Yeah.
Um, and actually, interestingly, my at her urging, I had the trip set, and I was going to leave June 31st for the north, and it's a couple day process to get to the north. And we were going to get married when I got back. We were going to get married in September. Then we lost the wedding venue. They double booked themselves. And the only other date that we could book it on was the day before I left for the Arctic. And so I asked her, do you want me to move the trip? She was like, no, you stick with the plan. So I got married on June 30th, 2019, and then left for the Arctic on June 31st on a solo honeymoon. We did have a proper honeymoon later. So I don't know how we can extrapolate that to give advice to other young men or young women looking for somebody who's supportive. All I can say is it's an amazing find when you do find somebody who's supportive of that, of those crazy type of situations that come up, like, hey, we're getting married one day and then you're leaving the next day, and I'm not going to hold it against you. And that's maybe the not holding it against me is the most amazing part of all.
Well, I think it's a testament to confidence and and where you're heading. The more you know what you want in life, the more confident you are about that, the more people are attracted to that. So it's not something that pulls away from you. It actually adds to the value that you bring to the table, even in relationships. I think it can be a challenge when someone's so driven to do things that are outside the norms, but it's also attractive. It's also something that you're interested in, and it makes you more interesting. And I think couples that embrace that will find a much happier relationship. And so, you set out on the 31st of June, and this is really where your book is based on this journey, correct? It's the
Yes.
perseverance journey. And so, what is the reader going to take with them if they pick up your book, and it's not out yet, right? We're still waiting on it to launch.
Uh, March 4th.
March
So if
4th.
this podcast comes out after March 4th, it'll be out. Uh, and if not, then I would love it if people pre-ordered it, because authors live and die by their pre-orders.
100%. Yeah, the pre-order. We'll definitely encourage everyone to pre-order, and we'll pick it back up at the end of the show for sure. So, walk us through the journey. Give everybody a little synopsis of the journey, and what was important, and what kind of what you thought you were going to do versus maybe what you were experiencing.
Well, it's not my first time in the bush, so I had a pretty good idea of what was what was in store for me. The trouble was, the last time I had done bigger journeys like that, I was 20 years younger and had two fully functioning kidneys, and also the passage of time tends to smooth over the bumps in the road, and so it was an incredibly difficult journey, because at the one end I was constrained by, you can't really get into the far north much earlier in the year because the big lakes are still covered in ice. On the other hand, you can't go too late into the year, say into late August, early September, because then you start getting the gigantic storms of autumn. And so the trip basically went from, call it, if you picture Canada, the middle of Canada, and a little bit further north than that, down to Hudson Bay. So Hudson Bay is this great big salt water body. It's that big basin that comes down, mostly surrounded by tundra. It's also the densest concentration of polar bears in the world, because that giant body of water in the winter, you've got all the bears out on the ice hunting seals or the occasional stranded whale or whatever it is. But when that ice melts in the summer, they all end up on the shore, within a couple miles of shore, waiting for the ice. So they basically starve all summer long. They'll eat if they can find something. If they can get their hands on a canoeist, that makes a tasty snack. But generally, they're quite hungry and quite grumpy, living off of fat reserves. And now that the ice-free time on Hudson Bay is increasing, those bears are getting hungrier as the years go on. So I was constrained at the far end of it by, I did not want to get stuck on the Hudson Bay coast, pinned down by a 5-day storm, unable to move, there in Polar Bear Central. It's really random. I've been to trips to Hudson Bay. Sometimes I've seen 14 bears in 24 hours. Other times I've seen no bears at all. And these are bears the size of a kitchen table that eat nothing but meat. I think Wikipedia describes them as hypercarnivorous. So there's no berries. There's no roots. There's nothing. There's just basically meat, seals, right? Human-sized objects, except we don't swim as well as seals do.
Right. So it's very dangerous, and I was reading through the first as I read through the first couple pages of your book, I was already stressed out. Like I'd started like it
I'm
was
sorry.
already stressful because I'm just thinking, first of all, I don't love cold.
Mm,
But I love nature, and I think it's definitely interesting. I did not grow up hiking and camping and
mm,
doing a bunch of outdoors things. I played sports, and that was
mm,
the out most outdoors that I spend. But a hike occasionally here and there on vacation, but nothing strict. Nothing like this. This is an adventure, and so it's just you're talking about the water hitting up against you and catching a sail, and it's just a really interesting dynamic. So you went on this adventure, and the adventure was, walk us through a moment or two where you really had to activate the true perseverance. I mean, you've already had to
mhm.
persevere through the kidney. Your brother's probably wondering why you're going to go risk his one kidney he just gave you.
Well, I think the hardest part of really anything is getting started, right? The first step, the old truism, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But really, the journey of a single day begins with getting yourself out of bed. And when there are so many reasons to not get moving, when literally every muscle in your body is going, I hurt, just let me stay in bed for today. And you're going, no, we got to get up. We got to get moving, regardless of how we feel, because there will be days when we are pinned down by wind. This is the royal we, me talking to every muscle in my body. Uh, there will be days when the wind is so strong or the storms are so bad that we won't be able to travel. And those will be the days that we rest on. Right now, we can make progress. So it's this idea of developing momentum. So the hardest parts were the days when it was cold outside. Your mind goes to funny places, right? At a couple days into the trip, one of my hands, for example, swelled up to the size of a grapefruit out of nowhere. And it was very, very painful to touch. And I'm not a doctor. I mean, I've got medical training from the fire department. So I'm thinking, is this an infection or is this just an overuse injury? And if it is an infection, if it gets worse, what are my options? Because I'm really quite far from help here. And with each additional stroke, I'm getting further from help. So then, your mind begins fantasizing about like, well, if I did have to amputate my hand, how would I do it? Would it be better with an axe or would it be better with a saw? Right? One would be messier, one would be quicker. I mean, as it turns out, it wasn't an infection. I don't think it was an overuse injury, and I've managed to find ways around it. But the point is that it's really just a mechanism for self-doubt to come in. Like, man, that hand really sucks. Like, maybe you should call this off. Yeah, maybe you gave it a try. You tried, you gave it the old college try, and it's just time to pack it in, right? It's self-doubt is this animal that kind of lurks in the back of the cave waiting for a moment of weakness and then jumps out and whispers in your ear. And it's a fine line because if you have no self-doubt, you're going to die. Or if you just uh, talk yourself into go on at all costs, you're going to die. You're going to be one of those bodies buried by the snow in Everest. And I can't, I have kids, I have a spouse, I have to think of them in my risk calculation. On the other hand, you have to be aware that self-doubt is going to use any setback it can to come in and begin whispering its lies to you to try and get you to stop. So that continuous battle, physically, I'd say it's fighting the wind. Fighting, it's one thing to be working as hard as you can and making progress. It's another thing to be fighting a headwind or a current. And it's an Alice in Wonderland situation. You're running as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. That's incredibly demoralizing. Or you're working as hard as you can just to creep ahead 1 meter at a time. And that can really add up. I mean, there were specific. So that was a constant. The, there were certain instances where I was, ran into some forest fires. I had some bear encounters. Um, on the other hand, you end up kind of in this bipolar existence. I don't mean to make fun of people who actually struggle
Right.
with bipolar, but it's just the worst moment. You're just exhausted. And then the clouds break open and the sun comes out and a tailwind comes and you see a moose and its calf, or you see even something as small as the wind going across the surface of a smooth lake. And you go from this low low to this high high. And it's this, no, I call it the bipolar roller coaster. And it is just part of that experience. So, some of the moments were absolutely sublime, and some of the moments were, I would say, very, very low.
How, how tell our listeners how long the trip was, and then give us some insight into food, because I always think that's always interesting to people listening. I know I barely can, function in a day where I don't know exactly where I could be eating my meal and already wanna know what I'm eating for dinner when I'm eating lunch. So, I'm
You like to
curious
plan
as
in
to
advance, eh?
yeah,
Yeah. Uh, so I had it planned for 50 days. That was my outside envelope. I had 50 days worth of food, and that works out to just under 250 pounds of food. So I counted on about 5 pounds a day, uh, which works out to very roughly about 5,000 calories a day, which isn't enough because if you're working all day, that burns a certain number of calories. But if you're wet and cold, or if you're out in the wet and cold all day, then that easily adds another 1,000 to 1,500 calories. So I ended up losing about 20 pounds. The
okay.
journey ended up being 42 days because I did push to have that envelope, but that I got it done 8 days faster than the bar extreme, but it could have been very possibly be pinned down there almost at the destination once I got to the coast for an entire week, at which point I would have had zero food reserves left, short of doing some hunting or doing some impromptu fishing, which I generally avoided. Um, and so, yeah, it's about 200, 250 pounds of food, and that's a lot. And you start carrying that across a portage to get around rapids, or even just pushing a boat across a lake with a headwind. Now you're sitting that much lower and it's that much more drag. Uh, it's not very exciting, right? You're eating the same thing for breakfast, pretty much. You're eating the same thing for lunch, pretty much. You're eating the same thing for dinner, pretty much. Uh, one, if you want, you can search on Google, Stephan Kesting energy balls. It was one thing that I ate pretty much every day. It's these super dense caloric concoctions of almond butter, oats, chocolate, nuts, maple syrup. And that's something I never got tired of eating. And it's just an easy, put an extra 500 calories in your mouth and go. So
Right.
that if people want to taste a little bit of what I was eating, they can go do that search.
Now you mentioned earlier, Stefan, that you lost two of your brothers, and if I
Mhm.
understand it correctly, you lost them in competing in adrenaline sports, right? It's some
Essentially, yeah.
essentially, and there's a correlation in your family dynamic, maybe even in the DNA, in
Mhm.
wanting to take on an added adventure. Where does that come from? How is that embedded in all of you so intimately?
Yeah. Well, there is research connecting genetics and willingness to take risk. And no, genetics isn't destiny, and there's also environment and genetics interact in all kinds of complicated ways. So that has to be understood. Um, Certainly, we were modeling my mother, who was the adventurous one. My mother, when she was a young girl, went and traveled around South America, basically backpacked across South America in the late 60s. And that's a fairly adventurous thing to do. She was always climbing mountains as a young girl and talking about it and taking us out into the woods. So that, I think, we were modeling her. Now, with some of us, that I don't know, adrenaline-seeking behavior was magnified. The first of my two brothers who died on a motorbike, and if he honestly, he had had so many close calls, right? Of course, he wanted to become a helicopter pilot, and that might well have ended in a fiery wreck as well. The uh, I don't really have a good answer as to why, other than both probably genetics and environment uh, coincided here to drive us towards those things. Also, and then ultimately luck. I mean, my second brother who died, this was difficult for me to process, died on a river. Now, he died on a river he had no business being on, paddling with friends who had no idea of what they were doing, using equipment that was not up to the task at all. Like a canoe that had no business in class 4 whitewater, especially in spring runoff. They had two life jackets between three guys. They had two paddles between three guys. It was idiotic. And it feels bad to say that about my brother, but that was an idiotic thing to do. And so when I approach risk, yes, I'm willing to do risky things, but perhaps informed by the death of my brothers, I do try to mitigate it as much as possible, right? It's not risk for the sake of taking risk. It's risk for the sake of getting something. In my case, it's risk for the sake of getting into an environment, a country, a terrain that hardly anybody ever gets to and hardly anybody experiences. And if they do experience it, it's from going to a warm fishing lodge where somebody cooks for them, cleans for them, takes them out on the lake for a few hours to catch a pike, and then they can come back in and retreat from that nature and separate, like, okay, outside this door is nature, inside this door is my shower, my laundry, my hot tub. I don't know. Depends how fancy a fishing lodge you're going to, I suppose.
I'd probably go to the fanciest one if
And there's
the
nothing wrong with
warmest.
that. Yeah.
I'm kidding. I'm just joking.
But when people think about going out into an environment where it can basically snow in August, or where the black flies are so thick that that they are crawling around the outside of your tent, trying to find a way in, and it sounds like rain because they're hitting the outside of the material. They think, oh my God, what if I went from my office out into that country? I would die. And you're right, you would die. And so would I, because the things that mitigate those risks are things like equipment, right? There's a big difference between being in the outdoors with a really good rain gear or with really good rain gear and not. There's a difference being out in that environment with a life jacket and without a life jacket. And then there's also training. And what have you done to build up your skills? Do you know what to do in such and such situation? It doesn't mean that things won't go wrong, but it gives you more options to deal with it as they happen. Yes, I had a hand the size of a grapefruit that I thought I might have to amputate in my darker moments. But I also had a medical kit full of antibiotics. I went to my doctor and I basically had a list of about 40 prescription medicines I wanted to take, and he gave me almost all of them, to his credit. And so I've got a good relationship with the doctor. And I went in there with about 4 different kinds of antibiotics and medications for this and medications for that. And so it wasn't just me stressing out about potentially losing a hand. It was me stressing out about potentially losing a hand, but also having the equipment to deal with it and having the knowledge to know what equipment I need to deal with it. So while acknowledging that my brothers died doing adrenaline sports, neither of them were taking steps to mitigate any of the risks. And since part of risk, taking risks ethically, is worrying about the effects of what you do on other people, I have to consider the effects of what I'm doing on, say, my kids. It would be interesting to go out there in the woods with an axe and a bag of beans and a blanket and pretend that I was an explorer from 300 years ago. But a lot of those explorers from 300 years ago never came home
Right.
because they didn't have high-end Gore-Tex. They were tough, but a lot of them also didn't make it. So I had to really move the needle in my favor. And risk mitigation is a huge part of that. And trying not to take risks for other people is a big part of that.
Yeah, and the value of preparation, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you're prepared properly, you really can take on some of the things we talked about earlier in the conversation, like just getting up and getting moving, having the right preparation, knowing that you've done the right things to put yourself in that position is really a stepping stool to that success in anything that we're doing in life, right? I mean, it's not just succeeding in ultra cold or adventurous lifestyle practices. It's just in everyday life, just being prepared in the right way can change the way that we see the next challenge.
And we do this all the time. You think, I'm just going to run down to the store to go, I don't know, grab a quart of milk at the corner store. I'm going to jump in my car and do that. When you think about how difficult it is to drive a car and how we have this licensing system and we send kids to driving school and then we drive with them and we're like sitting there, oh my God, with both of our fingers crossed and one hand on the emergency brake. And then probably we're going to ding up a car or two as we're learning to do it. And hopefully we don't injure anybody or ourselves. And then we have this arcane system of rules that govern who goes when, and lights and cops that'll give you a ticket if you go too fast, and cops that'll give you a ticket if you turn at the wrong time. And then a court system to make sure that the fines imposed by the cops get carried. Like, there's this massive infrastructure around something as simple as you going to the corner store to get a quart of milk. It doesn't just happen. And so you can make an argument that we are preparing all the time. And we get in the car, we put on our seatbelt, we try to look around, we follow all these procedures that are now completely ingrained. And we kind of know what we should do if we get a flat. We kind of know what we should do if somebody pulls out in front of us. We kind of know what we should do if, I don't know, somebody's tailgating us. And statistically, driving is an incredibly dangerous activity, yet we deal with that through equipment. We try to have a decent car. Oh, we've got airbags. That's good. We've got seatbelts. That's good. We try to deal with that through training. And we try and deal with that through contingency planning. If you're going to go for a long drive in a snowstorm, you're going to bring some things. You're going to bring, I don't know, chains. You're going to bring a shovel. You might bring some salt. Maybe I should bring a warmer jacket in case I get stuck.
A blanket in the car.
Yeah. Or do I even go? Fair
Right.
enough. These are all, people make these assessments all the time and they deal with risk all the time. And they just have the tools and the procedures and the infrastructure to support that. So I just have a different set of tools and a different set of procedures, and to hopefully support rampaging around the North in a reasonably safe way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just got back late last night from a trip in Ohio, and I was driving in the snow, and I'm not used to driving in the snow, but to mitigate risk, I rented the same vehicle that I drive at home. I made sure I had four-wheel drive, and I had to go in the snow. And again, the roads were not awful, but they were much worse than anything I'm used to driving in. People there are used to it, but someone like myself is not equipped for it. So I tried to mitigate all the risk that I could by having a similar vehicle, literally the same vehicle I drive at home. So I know where everything is. I know how to adjust the mirror. I know where the seat is and the right way to get myself settled. And I know when to turn it in four-wheel drive and when not to. And, you're thinking of these things. The older we get, the more we're a little focused on preparation. It's like, as a kid, your father or mother would say, grab a jacket. It's going to get cold tonight. And you're like, it's not going to get cold. It's fine. And you end up at the baseball park or at the soccer game or whatever you're doing, and it got freezing and they told you and you didn't grab it. The older we get, the more we're like, let's take two jackets. It might be a light jacket. It might be a heavy jacket. So it sounds like you made all the right decisions. You prepared properly. You did take risk, but it was mitigated by preparation to some extent. I mean, you can't factor in the 14 bears you see one day and the 0 bears you see another. Something that I did want to hit on briefly was, you talked about the value of being in nature and dealing with grief. I mentioned your brothers. I have a brother and a sister. I couldn't imagine losing them and or losing anyone that we love. And so many people listening to this podcast have lost people that they've loved. What was the process like, and what are some of the are there exercises? Are there mindset things when you're in nature? How can people cope with grief? Because you've processed this, it's worked with you, it's helped you. Um, walk our listeners through maybe some things that stand out to you.
Yeah. I don't know if my answer is going to be specifically useful to people, but it might be generally useful to people. So for me, the thing that helps me get into that mindset, well, I'll start with a story. So years and years ago, when I lost my first brother, when I lost Peter to a motorcycle accident, I responded to this, well, after being completely lost for the better part of a year. I decided that I would try and I didn't think of this. I'm going to heal from Peter by doing a
Right.
solo canoe trip, but I felt drawn to do a solo canoe trip. And I went and did a solo canoe trip. And after a few days of being out there, just, doing the normal canoeing stuff, I was paddling down a very large river, the Athabasca River in Alberta. And out of nowhere, I got clubbed across the back of the head by grief. And one minute I'm paddling, going, oh yeah, look at that tree. And the next minute I'm sitting in the boat sobbing. And I had not cried about Peter up until that point. I had gone into emergency management mode and dealing with it and what needs to happen and what do I do and I had very efficiently gotten absolutely nowhere in dealing with the grief, but I had managed to stave it off. And then all of a sudden it came back. And after being just inconsolable for a period of time, it slowly got better. So my answer for myself is time alone in nature for an extended period of time. Now, that's not necessarily the way that other people are going to deal with it. But for me, the things about nature, especially going alone into nature, is it creates an autonomy. It creates, I mean, you are ultimately responsible for everything that happens. Everything is your fault. Everything needs to be done by you. It creates a connection with nature, so a connection with something greater than yourself. And it allows you the time and the space to go inward, right? Your phone is turned off, or at least it's not in cell service anymore. So that ping, ping, ping from the outside world is off. So, and I think those two things, at least for me, the ability to turn inward and the ability to connect with nature, provide that space for the processing to occur at a subconscious level, really. I mean, my body is obsessed with stroke, stroke, stroke. Take a paddle, take a little correction stroke to get around that log. It's almost the same. And I don't practice Zen Buddhism, but you hear about Zen Buddhist practices of raking gravel or reaching enlightenment through cutting bamboo. And for me, my cutting of bamboo is paddling and doing the same thing again and again and again to kind of occupy the body and occupy sort of the procedural mind. Oh, I should go a little bit to the left. I should go a little bit to the right. Oh, the wind is coming from the north. That means I should go to this part of the lake. It sort of distracts the monkey mind and then allows the deeper processing to happen at a level below. I'm not going to say I was out there thinking profound thoughts. A lot of it is procedural. What do I do next? Oh, look at what is that? Look, here's some plants that are bent over in the current and they're bent over and they're not exactly in line with the river. What does that mean? Well, it means the water is going that way, but it creates the space. So I have no specific advice. I mean, if people want to do a long solo canoe trip to deal with grief, there's a bunch of stuff that you should do first, like acquiring the skills and the equipment and the knowledge. And if they want, they could reach out to me and I can help them with that. But I realize this is a very unique solution. It's my solution, and my solution isn't going to be your solution.
Well, what I take from that is not so much that if in severe grief that I need to take a solo canoe trip, What I get from that, and I think what listeners will hear here is, you know, I think when grief strikes, so often we look externally for someone or something to heal us or to numb us or to take us away from whatever it is that we're dealing with. And what you're talking about is going inward. What you're talking about is grounding. What you're communicating is becoming one with your own thoughts and actually allowing yourself to process those thoughts. Because people will leave, I think a lot of people will either stay in grief because they continue to search for that external reinforcement, or they do what you described. And I know a lot of men are definitely well known for pushing it down, but it's not just men. I mean, there's lots of moms that go into mom mode and lock it up and hold it down and keep the family moving forward while they're struggling on major
And they
things.
have to. And it's like the world doesn't stop just because you're sad. Like your mortgage payments keep coming,
Right.
or your kids still need their lunch packed, and it's honorable. Like you should, but at the same time, how do you create that space to grieve and you know not drown out the pain with addictive behavior? I mean, uh, in my case, I don't drink at all. There are way too many alcoholics in my family, but in that moment, I could see why people start drinking. Right? It would numb pain, and so what other behaviors is one doing to numb pain? Right? There can be things that are addictive, but not as destructive as booze or drugs. And you know, how do you create that time and that space to go inward? I think you're exactly right. And that can be tough. I mean, if you're a working mother grieving the loss of her mother or grieving the loss of, God help you, a kid, that, that's a tough row to hoe. How do you do that? And it's not necessarily, okay, now I'm going to take this month off, because you don't know when you're ready to deal with it, right? This is something that it'll let you know when you're ready to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think what the other interesting part about what you said is, um, our phones are a great resource for freedom in a lot of ways. We can go anywhere, we can do anything, and yet they ping us constantly. And with distraction, it's very difficult to be connected or grounded anywhere. I mean, it's amazing how free you feel. Every once in a while, even just going to a dinner or something, I forget my phone and I just leave it. And it's so freeing because there's no distractions. You're fully present. I think in order to heal, we have to be fully present in whatever space it is that we need to connect to make sure of that. And for me, spiritually, that would be really, really important. So, that's where I lean. But the reality is nothing can get you uh, more grounded than just being out in nature and being one with the land and the atmosphere. And so there's so many great takeaways there, Stefan. And I think sometimes just sharing your version and your story can make for a great reference point for people to find what their canoe trip might be, or what their nature trip might be. Maybe for that mom who's struggling with the grief of a loss of a parent, or from the child, God forbid, it's it's just making sure, remember that you deserve that time. You deserve a break. You deserve the step away. Yes, you have to, and it's admirable and courageous to stand up and lead because the rest of your family needs it. But when you need to take that break, when you're ready to heal, take it. Go figure out what your canoe trip is and go do it, because I think it's something that can really change people's lives. And that's what you're putting out there to the world.
I was on the Camino de Santiago, which is a pilgrimage path in Europe that, uh, of the two pilgrimage sites in Europe, Rome was obviously the biggest one. And then uh, the Camino de Santiago was the second most important one. And I was doing it out of historical interest and also to basically get my kids out and moving through sort of nature, through a rural setting, perhaps. But meeting people on the trail, it was very clear that there were people using the Camino exactly how you and I have been talking about. Now, is it wild nature? Are you completely isolated? Do you go weeks and weeks and weeks without seeing anybody? No, not at all. You're going from a hostel to a hostel. You meet people in the evening and then you go your own way. You might walk for 3 or 4 hours alone, have lunch somewhere at a cafe, sit on a rock for a bit, uh, drop into some 500-year-old Catholic church. Even if you're not Catholic, it's still a meditative space, and then carry on. And it became obvious that people were using this as kind of their healing journey. Now, healing journey sounds very, very woo. I don't mean it in any kind of sense like that, but they were on a journey and they were healing. And something like that is a lot more manageable than the crazy stuff that I do or whatever your road might be. And so
Well,
it was really,
my road would be the Camino, because just last night, this is something I've been planning and thinking about for years. Just last night, I put 2 pilgrimage books in my Amazon cart,
okay.
because I want to do the Camino. So it's interesting you bring it up, and it's something that it's been difficult for me to do because I have to separate for an extended period of time.
Mm,
And, I really don't want to do the half. I don't want to do like the 1 week version,
yeah.
and I might have to start with the 1 week version. But the reality is I'd like to really do an elongated walk. And so it's something I've been studying, and
Mm,
I am Catholic, and I do really love the way that, so many pilgrims have taken this journey. But it's interesting that you bring it up, because it's
yeah.
what I was thinking the whole time when I was thinking of the different canoeing, is that, sometimes you just need a break from life. It's not
Yeah.
about the grief.
Yeah.
It's not awful grief. It's not losing your sibling or your parent. It's just life has gotten so busy for you that you need to take a separation, and you need to remind yourself that there's good energy out there in all these different places. Maybe it's the cathedral that you mentioned. Maybe it's having dinner and drinks with new friends that you'll never see again, but they share their story. And maybe it's the humility of realizing that some people are living a life that's so much harder than what you're living, and they share it with you, and they're going through this journey, and you're a part of it.
Well, I can highly recommend, having done exactly one of the Camino routes, the route that I did, which is Porto up to Santiago.
So
So
that's
Porto in
Portugal.
Portugal.
That's
Yeah,
the coastal
yeah,
Portuguese route,
yeah.
correct?
It's stunning, and it's not impossible to take kids on it. I mean, we took bikes, so we cheated a little bit, and it's good that I did that because it meant less trudging for the little guys and more zooming really fast, probably way too fast, around pilgrims with scallop shells on their backpacks. But that it was lovely. It was lovely. And now, me as a parent shepherding a bunch of kids, believe me, the minutia of like, oh my God, where's this guy? Okay, we need to fix his bike chain. Oh my God, her raincoat's caught in the spokes again. There isn't a whole lot of room for me as a parent shepherding 3 kids
Yeah.
up the Camino to pause and reflect. But that's not the point. That wasn't the point of that. It would have been a very different experience if I'd been going, and it was 100% worthwhile. It would have been a very different experience if I was going there as a pilgrim alone, using this time to travel through space and to some extent through history, and knowing a fair bit about uh, European history. Is fascinating to walk that. And so you can use the same trip for 2 different reasons. One would be to go inward, and the other would be to just worry about your kids the whole time and
Yeah.
try and make sure that they're not getting run over by some car on some cobble road.
Yeah, mine are old enough now that we could do it. But I've more so thought of it as an internal journey, not an external journey. And maybe even one that I would take with my wife, where the two of us would go and kind of experience something different together, and have a unique internal personal experience while you're also doing something that's powerful together. So I'm definitely appreciative of you sharing that. I think it ties in great with what we're talking about. And I think a big part of perseverance has to do with how you deal with challenges that come your way. And so your book comes out March 4th.
That's right.
They can get it on all major sites. Is it Amazon and everything that normally?
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Indigo, wherever your local bookstore. You'll get it if you go to your local bookstore and you order it. they'll bring it in, and you'll have it March 4th.
And other
A-
ways that
And
go.
anyone who pre-orders it, I've figured out how to sign it. So if you want a signed copy, if you pre-order it now, then you'll get a signed copy.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely be pre-ordering one here. And how else can they find you, Stephan? That your message is uplifting, it's interesting and intriguing, it's adventurous, and I think you've done some really cool things in your life, and I'm grateful that you're sharing them with the world. How else can they find you?
Well, if I kind of lead a bifurcated life, there's Stephan, the Jiu-Jitsu guy. And if you search for my name on YouTube or you search for my name on Instagram, you will instantly find me. And if rolling around on the ground with friends and trying to choke them is your thing, I've got a ton of advice for you on how to better choke your friends. And then something I've been building up more recently is my other side of my personality. And that's if you search for Essential Wilderness on YouTube or on Instagram, you'll find that. I'm also on some other platforms. I'm on Blue Sky now. I'm enjoying that. But those would be the two places to start, I think. And kind of the left brain, I don't know if left brain, right brain is the right analogy, but multiple personality disorder, Stephan the Jiu-Jitsu guy, Stephan the outdoor guy.
Same guy, same great message, same goal of perseverance needed in both worlds. Stephan, thanks for joining me today. Thanks for being a guest on the High Performance Life.
Thanks so much, Scott. I really enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.